Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the book launch of our new publication, Unlocking the Potential of Digital Services Trade in Asia and the Pacific. Thank you to all the participants who are connected online and to the participants who are here with us today. Let me start by introducing our keynote speaker. Bruce Gosper is Vice President for Administration and Corporate Management of the Asian Development Bank. Mr. Gosper is responsible for the overall management of the operations in Budget, People and Management Systems Department. He has more than 40 years experience working with multilateral and regional organizations dealing with trade and economic policy. He was also Australia's High Commissioner to Singapore, and previously he was ambassador to the World Trade Organization in Geneva. So it is a pleasure to have you today, and the floor is yours.
Well, thanks very much, Rolando, and it's a pleasure to be here today to help with the launch of this publication, Unlocking the Potential of Digital Services Trade in Asia and the Pacific. So I'd like to begin by congratulating ERDC and the authors for this work, which I think is quite important work for the region and for the bank to be more closely involved in. So, and a very timely piece of work too, might I say, given many of the things that are happening around us. So if I might just make three comments. First of all, the opportunity that services and digital services provide the region are quite extraordinary. Some interesting things are happening with globalization. We can't really interpret them accurately at this point. Many supply chains are simplifying, and it does look like the trade in goods may have peaked, at least for the moment, but services trade continues to grow very strongly. And this is an important opportunity for the region. We've already seen services trade of something like $3.3 trillion over the past decade or so. And we see a global environment in which e-commerce is growing, predicted to be $8 trillion within just a few years. So very significant opportunities that await for the region in respect to services. But the reality is the services sector is a sector which in this region is probably underperforming a bit compared to some other areas. There's a host of reasons for that. Probably regulatory impediments and barriers of one sort or another are quite significant. But of course, that's not relevant to all areas of services, particularly intermediate services. They grow very strongly. They don't face the same barriers, and they provide some very significant opportunities for the region. There's a lot of data that's emerging in these sorts of areas. The OECD's Trade Restrictiveness Index is a very valuable source. And the WTO and the World Bank have set up a database which gives us all the WTO, the free trade agreement, and the applied services settings across many trade agreements. So this gives us a good perspective to look at what's happening in the region and what the opportunities really are. The second thing I want to say is that domestically, there are big needs in the region. In particular, they focus on digital infrastructure and on human capital. So digital infrastructure, and by that I mean both the software and the hardware, telecom systems and the like that really open up the opportunity, and of course human capital. And that doesn't mean just skill sets that are relevant in the organization. It means the governance structures as well that are around the digital economy. So economies need now to grapple with relatively simple things like electronic invoicing and paperless trading, but much more complex issues around cross-border data flows, around data localization, around digital identity, around the place of AI, and many other issues like this. These are complex issues that challenge developed economies, and for our DMCs in the region, no doubt they're equally and perhaps even more challenging. So the place of the bank in addressing those sorts of things, I think, is really quite important. But the third thing is an area where I think the bank can play a really very important role in stepping forward now. So if we look at the global environment for digital trade, it's evolved over a couple of decades. We go back, of course, to the Uruguay Round General Agreement on Trade and Services. We saw the Telecoms Reference Paper in '96. We saw the ITA, Information Technology Agreement, in '98. We saw the developments on e-commerce negotiations, on trade facilitation, on domestic regulation. All of those things are playing out in a way that's not really reflective of the pace of change of technological developments or the economic opportunity that's provided. In its place, we've had stepped forward, of course, a lot of plurilateral, regional and bilateral agreements. We've had the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a plethora of bilateral trade agreements, digital economy agreements, in essence, and that continues to go on now. Now, this is really important work because unless we have the sort of overall institutional structures that give us some guidance on these things, what we risk is policy incoherence, we risk regulatory heterogeneity and fragmentation, and we risk suboptimal outcomes on the economic opportunity. So it's really quite important that organisations like ADB invest in creating capability and the broad standards and practices that allow us to more fully grasp the opportunity of digital trade. And that's a really important piece of work. The bank has already done a lot of work on regional cooperation and integration, but I think the opportunity now, looking at the opportunity of digital trade and the scale of the issues that will need to be addressed in that, at both a local and a broader front, are quite significant. And I'm looking forward to the bank stepping into this space in a much more confident and assertive way. So thank you very much. Again, congratulations to ERDC and to the authors for this important contribution. And I look forward to supporting this ongoing work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, BP Gosper, for this very insightful introduction. I would like now to turn to our introduction for the book, which will be done by my colleague, Jung-Woo Kang. Jung-Woo is a principal economist at the Economic Research and Cooperation Department. He has extensive knowledge and experience in the area of trade, investment, and development. He's also the lead coordinator of our flagship report, the Asian Economic Integration Report. Thank you, Jung.
Thank you, Rolando. Thank you for your kind introduction. So let me briefly introduce to you the scope of the book itself and what are the key messages we are trying to articulate through this book. First, you might wonder when it comes to the digital service and digital service trade, what should be the scope of the research? So here, our basic scope of the digital service trade is the so-called digitally deliverable services, which can cover the insurance, pension, financial services, ICT-related services, and the professional and the management consulting services like the legal services, accounting services, etc., etc. So also including the med health and the online education type of the personal services. So the research is basically extensively using WTO OECD's balanced trade and services, so-called the BATIS data. So next slide, please. So as was emphasized by the VP Gosper's opening remarks, the services trade increased quite dramatically over the past decades. But as we all know, that during the height of the pandemic in 2020, services trade plunged quite dramatically. But on the other hand, when, as you can see from the center of the slide, the digitally delivered services were quite robust and resilient, in particular for the region, as was presented by the red line, and also for other regions such as North America and other regions. So in that sense, the digitally delivered services have been quite resilient and robust. And Asia's global presence has also increased quite dramatically for the past decades or so. As you can see from the right-hand side bar chart, Asia's share of the global digitally delivered services trade has increased from the 17% to 24% from the 2005 to 2020. So its global presence has increased quite a lot. And then the next slide, we also list up some policy recommendations. As again, the VP Gosper has alluded to, the first and foremost, investment in the human capital, this is the capacity and the literacy, as well as the investment in the hard infrastructure is quite crucial in developing the enabling environment for the digital service and digital service trade. And also, we also highlight the importance of the policy reforms on the front of the domestic service sector deregulation, as well as the international trade liberalization, which can foster the growth of digital service trade in the region and across the world. And also, as was also highlighted by the VP Gosper, he has alluded to a lot of the policy recommendation in this book already. So the digital flows and the data localization and the free data flows across the border is very much important. But at the same time, we also highlight there should be some balancing act which can also safeguard the data protection and the privacy, while at the same time we are pursuing the free flows across the border. And next, the international cooperation is very much important for the transparent, fair, and harmonized regulations and taxations and the liberalization through regional trade agreement and digital economic partnership agreement and or DEA, digital economic agreement, among others. And lastly, we also highlight the potential in equity-related issues. There could be some differential impacts and trade-offs according to different segments of the population and the society between the skilled and unskilled, as well as those living in the urban areas and those living in rural areas. This calls for the governments and the policymakers renewed attention to fostering some efforts to address digital divide and the distributional impact of the digital service trade going forward. Lastly, the next slide is to introduce the structure of the book. We have the five editors: Jong-Woo Kang, Matthias Helble, and Rolando Avendano, Pramila Crivelli, and lastly, Mara Claire Taya. And we have included the 10 chapters. First chapter is on the introduction and overview, which was done by the Rolando and the Matthias in-house. And the chapter 2 is about the trend and digital service trade in Asia and the Pacific, which was authored by our colleague in OECD, Antonella, who is the head of the trade and business strategies in OECD, along with Rolando and Wanicho of ADB. And chapter 3 looks at the factors affecting the competitiveness of the digital service trade, which was done in-house by ADB colleagues. And next chapter is about the services, digital delivery trade and the global value chain in Asia, which was examined by the Ben Shepherd, who is the principal of the Developing Trade Consultants Institution. And then chapter 5 is about the data-related restrictions and its impact on the digital services trade, which was done by the Eric van der Merel, who is the chief economist at the European Center for the International Political Economy. He will be also making the key presentation on this chapter shortly. And next chapter is about the service trade and trade agreements, which was done by Henry Gao, who is the professor of the Singapore Management University. And then we have also looked at ensuring cybersecurity for digital service trade, which was authored by Lennon and then the Han Wei Liu, who are from the Monash University of Australia. And the next chapter is about the trade in digital service and international taxation. So there are a lot of the implications on the cross-border taxation related issues, which was looked at by the Bruno da Silva, who is the professor of the Texas A&M University, and along with our Rolando. And then the chapter 10 concludes the book with policy recommendations, which was done by our ADB colleagues. With that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and I hope you will be. I mean, this book was launched this morning, and the book is available online. You can download the book freely, and I hope you all will be enjoying reading the book and find the book helpful for your thinking through the ways ahead in developing the digital service and digital service trade in the region and beyond. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jong-woo, for this brief introduction to the book that we hope motivate readers. Let me now move towards the next presenter in our session. So we have a keynote presentation by Eric van der Marel. As Jong-woo mentioned, Eric is the chief economist of the European Center for International Political Economy, and he has expertise in the area of digital trade, services trade, cross-border data flows, and associated digital trade services trade policy. So Eric was a key contributor to the preparation of the flagship report and the subsequent edited volume. And we are very glad to have you today for your presentation. Over to you, Eric. We can see you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I can see you too. So let me start. So this presentation is based on the chapter that I contributed to the book, and it's about data-related restrictions and the impact on digital services trade in Asia compared to the rest of the world. And so I'll give you a brief overview of what I have done, and then I'll put the results also in a wider picture to discuss the policy implications of the results that were found here for this chapter. Now, first, I mean, I think this is by now a relatively known picture, in the sense that what was said before is that if you look at the standard globalization metrics or indicators that you have out there, you would see that that globalization in goods has been, I mean, growing tremendously since 1990, but then halfway after the global financial crisis saw a glitch, and then somehow did not grow any further compared to other types of globalization, such as in digital and digital-enabled services that have been growing strongly. And so if you compare the growth rates of these two types of globalization, you see that digital services or services that are traded over the internet, digital-enabled, digital-delivered services, have been growing very fast. And so that type of globalization is continues to growth. And if you ask me, I mean, in about sort of 20, 30 years, that type of globalization will drive the overall level of the overall growth of globalization. And so that type of globalization is, in my view, driven by, of course, technology, for sure, as always, but also by other types of flows, of which data flows is a very important one. But for example, the role of ideas or the flow of ideas are similarly a flow that drives that type of new globalization, as I would call it. And so because we are now discussing data-related restrictions that may have an impact, or that this chapter has shown to have an impact on that new globalization, of course, data flows become a very important focal point, because all what these kind of data-related policies and regulations do, they try to regulate that exponential growth of data flows, right, that you see here on the right-hand panel. And so what does this chapter do? This chapter looks at these data-related regulations, which, I mean, shortly we'll call data restrictiveness or data-related restrictions. And it really builds up on previous research that have been done before, that looks and sort of aggregates picture of what these different data restrictiveness or data regulations do for digital trade, but it did not really sort of set out the specifics of what these data-related restrictions individually did for digital globalization or digital trade. And that's what this chapter does. This chapter looks at the three types of data-related restrictions that have been taken up in previous research, which are data localization, local storage requirement for data, and strict conditional flow regimes. And then what it also does, of course, this chapter is to look specifically where and what type of restrictions have an impact in Asia compared to the rest of the world. And so if one follows the literature, so far we only have an aggregate picture of where things are taking place and how, but not specifically to a geographic area in the world, neither the specific regulatory restrictions that are doing their negative part for digital trade. Now, why Asia? If you look at, for example, data localization policies only, you see that a lot of the action is taking place in Asia. And so therefore, that is indicated here in dark red. So the more red the country, the more stricter these localization policies related to data are taking place. And so that's what you see here, that a lot of that policy action is taking place here in Asia. And so that's why it's interesting to look at Asia. The more so because if you relate all these data related restrictions, it also captures a large part of digital trade that takes place in Asia. And that's what you see here on the left-hand panel. And so the more so it becomes interesting to look at Asia, what kind of regulatory policies related to data are taking place and doing their part in terms of having that negative impact on digital trade. And so what are these, or how does it look like if you set these three different data related policies next to each other? You see again that a substantial part of these three policies that are out there in the world that regulate data are also taking place in Asia. The aggregate sort of the overall motivation, of course, reason to look specifically at Asia is it's not only, a lot of that action takes place in Asia, including that trade. But if you think about sort of the overarching story of globalization, I mean, globalization is, of course, pivoting towards Asia. I mean, that's something that we could have seen, that we have seen in previous research by other economists. And if you think about, these data-related restrictions that are having such an impact on digital trade, whereas we know that globalization is pivoting towards Asia, what Asia does in terms of regulating that new type of globalization becomes therefore, of course, very much important because it has repercussions for, the rest of the economy, the rest of global trade. And so Asia is really an important geographical area to look at, in my view. Now, I mean, the fact that what this chapter shows is that a lot of that policy action takes place in Asia. It's not something that, I found myself alone with the work that we have done here also at eCypher. But if you look at, for example, the OECD DSTRI, you see that some Asian countries in recent years also have increased their level of restrictiveness, such as in Turkey, India, and even Japan. But I mean, Japan started from 0, but has changed a small law here and there. And so has slightly increased, really slightly increased its level of restrictiveness according to the OECD DSTRI. And China, of course, I mean, that's the big player here that, of course, in Asia becomes very much important. So all to say is that other indicators also pick up the trend what you see in Asia. And that is also summarized here if we do our own analysis, or I have done my own analysis together with my co-authors, looking at all types of digital trade restrictions in the world that we have done a couple of years ago, and that we are now, by the way, trying to update. And this is work that we are doing together with the European University Institute. And there, I mean, you see as well that, the conclusions are consistent in the sense that a lot of that policy regulations are taking place in Asia. And so if you were to compute that level of restrictiveness as we have done in previous work, you really also see that not only the sheer number of restrictions are high in Asia, but also in terms of the level of restrictiveness that you can see here by the red dashed line are increasing in Asia and increasing faster than the rest of the world. So again, all to say is in terms of motivation, it's important to look at Asia. Okay, so as my predecessor already said, Yongbo Kang. I mean, here, I mean, the sectors to look at are summarized here in this table that you see here in the left panel. These are the pure digital services, such as telecom services, computer services, information services, but also, I mean, other types of services that are dependent on software technologies and other types of ICT technologies that are not necessarily digital services, but which what I would call digital enabled, or which the OECD handbook calls digital delivered services. Now, important to know is that even if you look at the entire range of digital enabled services that the OECD handbook classifies, a lot of these services are covered, such as also education and health, which is good, but not always sort of useful in the sense that if you use other indicators of measuring how software intense or ICT intense these all these services sectors are, you come up often with a list that excludes a lot of the health, a lot of that educational services, a lot of transport services, and what you end up is having a list that you see here listed under digital enabled services. It includes research and development, professional and management services, all these kind of business type of services. Another type of service that is often included in this list of digital enabled, but not always, are the audiovisual services and other cultural and personal services. And so, yeah, all to say is that, I mean, there is a distinction between the pure digital services and the digital enabled services that we will always also see when we were discussing the results of this assignment. And so, what does this chapter project have as conclusions? Well, if you look at the distinction between digital services and digital enabled services, in both cases, you see that data localization are problematic, but they are, what the results show, even more problematic for the Asian region. And so both types of digital services, or both types of services, digital services and digital enabled services, are suffering from the data localization policies that we see across the world, but specifically in Asia. The distinction between these two types of services sectors come in when we look at conditional flow regime, because next to data localization and strict storage requirement, we also picked up strict conditional flow regimes. And there we see that these regimes, they have a negative impact when we look at digital services, but they have an ambiguous kind of effect when we look at, when we increase the definition or expand the definition of digital services to also include these kind of business services, as I was just telling before. And so the interesting part then of these results really come down to this conditional flow regime. And it is interesting for a couple of reasons. And one in particular is that, I mean, if these digital enabled services seem to be so sensitive to this particular regime, you need to delve into the specifics of that type of regulation or conditional flow regime that you have. And often what is the case in these kind of data regulatory models is the issue of data protection. And so to me, it seems that if one expands the scope of these digital services, the role of data protection becomes very much important, or in otherwise put, like the role of how governments are processing personal data or data of data subjects, citizens, then becomes a focal point to look at. And so then I think sort of for the next stage of research, it becomes important to know how that data protection or that data processing sort of rules and regulations have on what kind of impact they have on digital globalization or that digital trade. And that's, of course, in my view, an empirical question. We need to sort out to what extent that data protection is enhancing or inhibiting digital trades, and how, like in what manner, basically. And so I think in terms of the next step for policy researchers, I mean, this will be, I think, the focal point. Now, what does that mean for policy? I mean, the conclusions of the chapter, if you would translate that into policy, I mean, are, I think, on the one hand, straightforward, and on the other hand, a little bit more complicated, which also makes it interesting. So first of all, I mean, the straightforward policy implication is that one should remove all these data localization policies that you see globally, but also in Asia. And so then, of course, it becomes a story of, you know, looking at how these PTAs look like, what do they do? Are they very meaningful? Do they really have a bite in, or do they really make sort of a dent in that, in digital trade in Asia? Are the GSI talks, for example, at the WTO meaningful? Are there enough countries that participate, for example, and that discuss these kind of localization policies? I think this is, I mean, the policy implications for that are pretty straightforward, I think. The ambiguous result with respect to conditional flow regimes, I mean, there things are becoming a bit more complicated because the number one kind of, you know, geographical region in the world that has this kind of flow regime, and which is very much discussed globally, is of course the EU's GDPR. So there is an element that one could say, well, you know, the countries that are trading with the EU with such a conditional flow regime, I mean, they sometimes find it very difficult then to export back to the EU market. Not to say that that is also happening in Asia, but that is sort of the focal point when we often discuss this kind of conditional flow regime. And the question here is, okay, if that's sort of a model to follow, I mean, some policymakers are saying that the GDPR, the data model that the European Union follows, is very strict. And so in what manners does that then really enable trade? Now, again, then that story comes back to the data protection issue, because that's what really, I mean, the EU conditional flow regime is really all about. And so again, I mean, I would advocate for more research in that area. And then in particular, something to look at, which I think is also important for Asian countries, is that if that data protection is really causing that positive or negative direction of trade, which I suspect would be going into the more positive direction for international trade in digital services. I mean, it becomes very much important to look at the institutions and the regulatory capacity of the regulators or the policymakers that determine the digital governance of a country, because they are often, at least what we see here in the EU and in other countries as well, they are often the ones that determine the rules regarding that data protection and the processing of data. So that is then, I think, something to be aware of and to look at, and also to look at whether, you know, this quality of these institutions that deal with data regulations are really having that important effect for digital services trade. The wider questions, I mean, in terms of policy, is how Asia connects to data models that we see elsewhere in the world. I mean, the EU is just one example, right? Other countries have, in Asia, precisely have tried to connect their data models, well, to, in this case, the EU, such as Japan, right? So Japan has done its bit to make its data model, its regulatory regimes related to data compatible with the one in the EU. And so other questions that come up, I think, in terms of policy is that, okay, so if that's the regime, or the conditional regime, I mean, that is so important for world trade, I mean, how does that type of conditional flow regime connect, for example, to APEC's CBPR, cross-border privacy rules? Is that compatible in the long run? Should it make compatible in the long run? Other questions, I think, that are becoming also important if we look at the, if we take that regulatory model for conditional flow regime very seriously, is that how does it look like for other countries in Asia that are more dependent on a different type of regulatory model that is much more centered around China? Because the wider context in which these three regulatory rules that we have discussed here in this chapter are part of, are often, if we look at globally, they are part of three types of data models. They are part of a wider regulatory package or model And if you look across these globes, how these models look like, you come up with 3 different types of models. That is first an open model, an open transfers and processing model, where the emphasis is lying on self-certification and self-assessment, and in terms of cross-border data transfers, which I mean is a model that is very much driven by the US. What you also see in that model regarding data processing or data privacy, that it lacks any kind of regulatory framework to protect that data privacy. Then you have a second model, a regulatory safeguards model, which is, you know, the conditional flow regime of the EU that some assess as strict and others are, I mean, are in the European Union more in favor of that. That comes with conditions. So countries can use EU citizens' data, but it needs to fulfill certain conditions. And of course, then the debate is whether these conditions are very strict or not. But it has a data privacy kind of framework where it gives rights to this data subject. And so that is the distinctive feature here of that regulatory model. The third one is the government-controlled model, or what I sometimes also call the China model, or the model that is very much focused on the one that is advocated by China, that comes along with very strict conditions, including a ban to transfer data across borders, or has very strict local processing requirements, and has extensive exceptions for government access to personal data. And so if you think about how these 3 data-related restrictions that we have looked at here at the chapter, I mean, they often need to be seen in a broader context of, you know, the broader regulatory data models that are out there, because it does really have, they do really make a difference with respect to how countries trade digital services with each other. Now, here you see that there is a picture of how the 3 different data models look like across the globe. The green one is the open model, the blue one is the EU model, the safeguards model, and the red one is the very strict conditional, the very strict limited data model. And here, this picture represents that for the regulatory policies that target the cross-border flow of data. And so here you see that a lot of this policy action, again, sort of takes place in Asia. Now, as I said, that is important because if you do some analysis of how these data policies relate to the trade patterns between countries, and we have done some research on that for last year for the World Bank's World Development Report, what we do see is that these conditional flow regimes, or these data models that come along with conditions and that try to target the data privacy of citizens, you see here that there is this positive correlation between countries that have that model in place and the extent to which they are able to trade digital services. And so, I mean, again, this is research that was done last year, and we see this positive impact. But again, I mean, more research needs to be done there, how that looks like in more detail regarding the rules for data processing. And so, I mean, I think that's an important message also for Asia, because the distinctive sort of difference, or the difference where the results come in, is really about these strict conditional flow regimes. So it becomes important how these things are going to be regulated in the future, and how they enhance trade, and in what manner, and for which type of regulatory rules specifically. Oh no, in terms of overall conclusions so far that we found here for Asia, is that there is this negative relationship, or this negative impact between data-related restrictions and digital services trade. I mean, that takes place in Asia, but I mean, the sheer number of restrictions are also there, of course, in Asia. And so, yeah, that's something to also take into account. It becomes it is the role of data localization that has, or that drives that negative impact on digital services, and of course strict conditional flow regimes as well. But again, it depends how these conditional flow regimes are formulated, and how the specific types of rules. I mean, that requires further research, how that has an impact on digital flows. And so I think also the question that needs to be discussed here is how then, I mean, if these conditional flow regimes in some ways or another enable that digital enabled trade, how do then the smaller countries that have a particular data model in place connect with, you know, the three sort of, or one or all three, or whatever the smaller country is dependent on, connects to the larger market that has one data model in place? Because I think a lot of the trade benefits of these smaller countries, they need to come from how, in terms of digital services trade, how they connect to the bigger markets where a lot of these trade benefits will have to come from in the future. So if you take a country like Thailand, for example, or bigger countries like Indonesia, how can a country like Thailand or Indonesia make its regime compatible with one or two of the bigger markets on which it's dependent on? And so that is really something that is key for future policy discussions. Okay, let me stop here, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eric, for this very, very rich presentation, and also opens a lot of questions and future avenues for research and work to continue in this area. Let us move to the second part of our event today. Now we will go into the panel discussion. And for that, I would like to invite our moderator and panelists. I will start maybe with the in-person participants. So our moderator for today is Sin Young Park, who is, as we know, the director of the Regional Cooperation and Integration Division at the Economic Research and Cooperation Department of ADB. I would like to invite also Francis Kimba, who is Research Fellow at the Philippine Institute of Development Studies, who will be one of our panelists. Also my colleague Pramila Krivyali, who is economist at the Regional Cooperation and Integration Division. And our two virtual guests, Thomas Abel, who is the Chief of Digital Technology for Development at the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department, who is joining us from the US, I believe, and Stephanie Honey, who is the founder of Global Trade Insights. So thank you very much for being with us today. And yeah, we can start the panel discussion now. Thank you.
Hi, Thomas. Hi, Stephanie. I hope you guys can actually see us, hear us fine.
You look great, thanks.
Okay. So I don't know which way I should look to. This is okay, right? Okay. So, well, thank you very much for joining the panel today. There are really a lot of important questions regarding how to address the cross-border data flows and the data localization and restrictions on these data flows. Let me first go to Stephanie. You know, cross-border data flows in general are still very limited and restricted across Asia and the Pacific. In your experience, are there like some special challenges facing the region in lowering the barriers to cross-border flows?
Thank you very much, Sin Young. And may I just start by congratulating the authors of this report and the editors. It's a fantastic publication, and Eric for an excellent presentation just now. Look, I think there are a range of challenges confronting the region. As Eric has made the case very compellingly, you know, the heart of the action on digital trade is really happening in Asia. But we see in the region a number of very different philosophies about how to regulate the digital economy, which is articulated, I guess you could say, through these different approaches to cross-border data flows. And there's been quite a lot of work done on looking at the different, I guess you could say, philosophical underpinning of, for instance, the Chinese approach, which emphasizes the importance of a sort of centralized control of data and content, as opposed to, for example, a US approach, which favors a very much a sort of corporate lens, enabling business, through to the EU, which, prioritizes sort of the human rights dimension of the digital economy, and so makes its conditional flow regime to respond to that. I think, there are clearly some very valid concerns that economies in the region have, whether around protecting personal information or cybersecurity or consumer protection, and a host of other sort of legitimate public policy objectives. But it's also fair to say that in some cases, what we're seeing here is a bit of a case of old wine in new bottles. I mean, there is very clearly an element of protectionism that we see in play as well, where countries perceive that controlling data controls the center of economic value. And so that's why, some of these measures are being imposed to essentially retain the ability to add value and to control the value within each economy. But then I think if you look at some of the emerging and developing countries in the region, there is also this issue which Eric touched on very significantly, which is that for many countries in the region, they don't even really have some of the basic institutional and regulatory building blocks in place to regulate the digital economy. And, that's not a criticism. I mean, this is a sector that's evolving incredibly rapidly. With every day or month that passes, we see new technological innovations. And so it's really no surprise that even developed economies are struggling with this. I'm from New Zealand, and there's a big process of, soul searching going on, even in New Zealand, about what our strategy should be for digital trade. So I think, all of those factors play into this picture of sort of fragmented digital data flow governance, and really drives this patchwork of approaches that we see. And as Eric made the point, that leaves developing countries in a very difficult position as to how to engage with some of the larger economies and the larger governance regimes in the region.
Oh, thank you. You pointed a very important, the element of the institutional legal framework. But we also see a rising the digital economic partnership agreements in variety of forms in the different places in the region and the world. Does this change the picture? Do you think like somehow the harmonization of these type of digital economic agreement help shape addressing these issues?
I do. I think it's a very promising mechanism that is being developed. There are a number of these new digital economy agreements, you rightly say. Most of them are bilateral, and that has value. Some of the sort of thought innovators can come up with new approaches in that sort of like-minded context. But to me, the most promising is the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, the DEPA, between New Zealand, Singapore and Chile, but with a number of other countries applying to join as well, because it is designed as an open plurilateral, a building block to a sort of broader, more coherent approach. And it's also got this other novel quality, which is it bakes in some rules for sure on data flows. For example, it takes the same approach as CPTPP, a very sort of US, if you like, model that favors free and open flows of data with very limited exceptions. But it also looks to sort of co-design and respond to technological innovation. So there's a lot in it that goes beyond data flows and is trying to essentially design rules for the digital economy as our understanding collectively develops. about what the legal implications are, the economic, the business implications, because I think one of the challenges for developing countries in the region, but even for developed countries too, is that we just really don't understand the implications of some of these new models of business. And it's quite hard to write the rules without that. But I think it's critical for developing countries to be in the room to help design those rules. People are writing them now. And it's really important for developing countries to be able to have a voice at that table and help to design them.
Thanks, Stephanie. I think this actually linked very nicely to a question that I would like to raise to Pramila. Compared to this DEPA, which tends to be still a very small group, and then like-minded economies, and then plurilateral at best, we have seen the rise of a really mega regional deal, RCEP, but they do not go in depth in the digital services. Can you elaborate and then explain to us, like, to what extent the RCEP addresses some of these digitally deliverable trade and then digital trade related issues?
Yes, thank you very much for the question, Sin-Young, and thank you also for the very good presentation earlier by Eric and the intervention by Stephanie. I think indeed, so we have these mega regional agreements or even other types of regional agreements. We may have some overlaps in digital trade rules. I think we all know about the noodle balls of digital trade rules in the region. And one thing that I want to point out from the beginning in my answer is that there is no such thing as digital services in a chapter in trade agreements. And that makes I would say the discussion a bit more difficult in the sense that there is one part that will overlap with DEPA or digital agreements. That would be what you will find in the e-commerce chapters, all the rules on data flow, cross-border data flow, or data localization. These elements you will find in a trade agreement. And then something that we discuss less about this when we discuss digital services trade, because we tend to focus on the digital part, but there is also the part of services. And services is in fact extensively covered in trade agreements. The services chapter is important, and all its annexes, and in the case of RCEP, you have annexes on professional services, financial services, and all these are liberalized in different ways, using either a positive list approach or negative list approach. And so we have conducted some analysis together with ERIA to codify the services liberalization rates in RCEP. And what we find, focusing now on mode 1. Why mode 1? Because as it is also discussed in the book, mode 1 is a good proxy for digital services trade, since it is the cross-border, the services that are delivered cross-border. And we find that the liberalization rates under RCEP for mode 1 is 46.1%. Well, you may say it's difficult to know what it means in terms of is it good or is it bad? Well, if you compare to the GATS, we had 23.3. So it goes beyond what we had under the GATS, but it's not so surprising because it's also years later. And we have a wide variability across countries. And this is also something we need to investigate, because we have a group of countries with more than 60% and some countries with 0. So, and I think maybe we can hear more in the next intervention on the Philippine case, because we have found out that there is a very low liberalization. And so, yes, so my answer would be there is a potential to complement, and especially on the services part, to further liberalize.
Thank you. Well, let me bring in Thomas Abel, who's our Chief of Digital Technology for Development. I think it's a fundamental question. How do we use digital technology for development? Thomas, you've been actually advocating for an integrated approach to digital development in Asia Pacific. Does this discussion of developing the legal institutional framework for digital development? How important is it? Like, how do we actually work to promote that development in the region?
Sure. Thanks, Xin Young. And I just want to also congratulate the authors. It's a very timely and important work. And your question is right on that regulatory frameworks are going to be really important, as outlined here, but also, in the areas of basic access to technology, the policies for getting well beyond the 50% we have now in the region of internet access and I'd say the widening digital divide. We know that the rollout of 5G is not really focused on extending access as much as improving the service for existing customers. And we also see there's a tremendous amount of interest across the region in how governments can improve their policy and regulations in many areas, just simply telco regulations around spectrum and sharing of infrastructure is super complicated as the technologies keep moving ahead rapidly. There's a lot of interest in that. We had an event in the Philippines just a few weeks ago with USAID, where we had 8 mayors. It was focused on bridging the digital divide in the Philippines. I had 8 mayors and hundreds of people online. And I think there's just a huge amount of interest in across the regulatory spectrum down to the mayor level for people getting, this kind of access. And then if you look at another area like tech startup ecosystems, we find there's a constant demand for policy advice in this area, because that's another, I'd say, area of infrastructure that's heavily driven by regulations, and it's changing all the time. Every government wants to look at the latest, what incentives are countries doing to bring, to make the tech startups in their country competitive and successful across the globe. And it's heavily driven by these competitive questions, again, about how each country wants to be successful in the digital economy, and they're going to use all the levers they can to either protect themselves or open themselves up when they think they have fair opportunities. And I think we can do a lot of work in all of these areas, to share information at the very least. We're working in a few different places. The mention of Vietnam, we're helping them with some e-transaction laws where they asked us to do benchmarking of across the region of how their legal framework looks compared to others. It's a fairly narrow area, but it's very useful in a kind of a core area in digital. We're working with our Central West colleagues to create a new TA for Pakistan to look at how they can do more work in exporting digital services, because they look at their neighbor in India that's a huge player in that space, and they're way behind. And I think that it's an area that they feel like they have capability, and economically it's just such a huge win. So I think that this area will continue to grow, especially when you can start to solve the privacy and security issues. It will really, I think, free up governments to be more aggressive about promoting growth, because right now the citizens are so nervous about privacy and security that they tend to push their governments to be, I think, a little more conservative. And I think the 3 models that the publication talks about are actually showcasing to the world different approaches that we can all learn from. And if we can solve those privacy and security issues and show the public where these digital jobs are happening, and they're going to gain more from opening up than they'll lose, we should see a lot faster movement. So I think across all those dimensions, we can we can do a lot with our DMCs, hopefully. Thanks.
Thanks, Thomas. Well, actually, both Pramila and then Thomas mentioned Philippine cases. So let's hear from Francis. So what's going on in the Philippines in terms of, developing the digital policies and the regulations?
Um, First, before I respond, being an outsider here, I think I should thank the organizers for welcoming me to this book launch. And I wish to congratulate also ADB for a very successful event and a very promising publication. Then to answer the question, I think one thing that's really helping the Philippines, as we've heard, the case of the Philippines, as a lot of IT-BPM that's really reliant on data flows. What's really supporting the Philippines is its participation in the APEC cross-border privacy rule system, and I think that's really what has been driving all of the growth of the IT-BPM. And um, yeah, one study that we did a few years, I think last year, it shows that the Philippines enjoys a non-restrictive policy environment for cross-border data flows. And this is complemented, as I mentioned, by this membership in the APEC CBPR system, which aims to promote interoperability of privacy regulations through the enforcement of minimum standards. We've conducted a number of interviews with private sector participants, and they said that the foreign private sector actually perceives the Philippines policy environment for data to be one of the best in ASEAN, and that's really what we've heard from a lot of these the interviews. The APEC CBPR certification actually serves as a seal of privacy compliance and accountability that creates a competitive advantage in both local and global markets. And it also fosters trust among consumers, which assures that their personal data is securely transferred. And this trust is gained by requiring business entities to observe transparency and streamlining the customer complaint process. And through this initiative, the Philippines is expected to adopt or has started to adopt common barriers, common standards for data privacy and eliminate data flow barriers in transactions with APEC economies. And this initiative also requires the Philippines to identify at least one APEC-recognized accountability agent to certify local companies as CBPR compliant. So the certified businesses will then be able to seamlessly and to safely transfer and receive personal data with other certified companies in the region. And as I've mentioned, that's what's supporting the growth of the sector. And the Philippines' inclusion, as I said, in the APEC CBPR system is a good step because it allows the country to integrate with the economies in the Asia Pacific. But there's still a room for improvement. No? So there's issues on the presence of a conditional flow regime in the financial sector, which still needs to be addressed. Maybe I'll talk about it in the next intervention.
Thank you. Well, you did mention that you actually take after the APEC. So there's really some importance of having the international architecture, some kind of like a common standards. You also mentioned about the interoperability, like where there's at least some minimum so standards and then guidelines for all the international community to follow. That would be great. Like, but in terms of making that kind of, some common ground, what could be the priority areas, shaping this international like framework? What are the priority areas to consider? Like, let me maybe first to go to Stephanie. Can you share some thoughts?
I'm sorry, Sun Young, would you mind just repeating that? You cut out at the critical moment.
Okay, sorry. Well, there are, if there are some priority areas for international common ground for digital policies and regulations, what could that be? She's muted. Okay, yeah, Stephanie, you're
Okay,
muted.
thank
Yeah.
you. Yeah, well, I do think that there is certainly some areas of common ground that are, you know, perhaps in the sort of less contentious spheres of the digital economy, for example, around trade facilitation and some of the other areas that the WTO e-commerce plurilateral has been able to make progress on. And even though those don't get at the greatest areas of friction, they would make a tangible difference to businesses. So things, you know, for instance, around facilitating digital services, transactions, e-payments and so on. But I do think that there's clearly a lot more work that needs to be done to narrow down the exceptions that all economies would want to impose when it comes to digital trade flows. So I think, you know, there's some very important work that's going on in APEC, for example, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, on CBPR and trying to see how that may interoperate with GDPR, and also some of these other conversations, whether in DEPA or in regional trade agreements, to understand more about the sensitivities of, you know, different countries in enabling data to flow. I think fundamentally, you know, there are some big misunderstandings about what the technology can actually do. We're all taking our sort of old analog mindsets and trying to apply them to the digital economy, which technologically isn't necessarily going to end up with the same result. So I think fundamentally more conversations about what it is that's sensitive, how we can tackle it technologically would actually really make a big difference. So that's why I think that fora like this, the RCEP process, DEPA, and other institutional sort of conversations are incredibly important.
Thank you. Pramila, are there specific areas of, you know, RCEP in the implementation that we can, you know, try to improve the interoperability of the systems to promote the digital services trade?
Thank you very much. Well, in RCEP, the digital provisions per se are not as deep as other agreements like CPTPP or DEPA. And although we have a breakthrough, if we can call it this way, in the sense that we have the prohibition of data localization, or we have like free flow of data, I think it was clearly mentioned by Stephanie that we need to work towards limiting the use of exceptions. And RCEP is in fact not an exception to that rule, because indeed the exceptions under RCEP are very, let's say, flexible for countries to apply, and they can. So I think there is a need here to facilitate the implementation and to make sure that rules are enforceable. To work also with, there is a dialogue framework on e-commerce under RCEP as a living agreements to, you know, maybe deepen the provision or improve them in the future. So we need to make the agreement more enforceable. And also an important point is that the e-commerce provisions are not covered by the dispute settlement mechanism. So in the same way, we may have a limitation in the enforcement of digital regulations. And I think these are the areas where we need to improve under RCEP.
Okay, thank you. Well, Thomas, what should we do? What can we do to like really maximize the benefits of you know, the digital technology for development, and how can we further reduce the digital divide?
Well, I think first of all, we need governments to look at how bringing people online will actually improve development outcomes and will effectively pay for itself. This is the problem of the telco business model, that telcos are really not incentivized to serve the poor or disconnected because they just can't make money off of it. And the governments have all these universal service funds and incentives and things like that, but yet they still really look at you know, gaining revenues from the telcos that maybe would be overwhelmed by revenues from a larger digital economy. And these are very difficult transitions to make, but I do think that we're kind of heading in that direction. And the technology itself is, you know, will always move ahead. So eventually we'll get there, but it's just a question of, can we speed it up? And can we make it clear that digital jobs are the outcome, you know, that digital inclusion includes digital jobs and livelihoods, and it doesn't require people with college degrees. You know, there are jobs, a lot of digital jobs that go to less than college educated people, and really making it clear that these opportunities are there. I think this goes back again to the Philippines, where you have the 1.2 million BPO jobs, and that the event we had a couple weeks ago, these mayors wanted to bring call centers into their towns. These were not, you know, these were mayors from across the Philippines and smaller towns. And with COVID, I think they've proven that people can work remotely, and people can do digital jobs from smaller towns, and all they need is the connectivity and the people to work in those jobs. And like a huge opportunity now that's being recognized. So people are kind of demanding the regulatory frameworks and the you know, the infrastructure to be you know, built out.
So in the Philippines, do you see any special challenges? Like what would you ask the policymakers to do to address those challenges?
Well, I think the priority is really to make sure that there's good infrastructure. I think that's the one thing that was mentioned in the very beginning of this forum, and even as we close, I think that's still going to be the basic foundation, is that even if these mayors want to bring the jobs to their locality, the quality of the connection that has to be accessed by these workers really needs to be reliable. And if that's not even in place, then there's really going to be a major barrier to this. But more than that, I think there's also the need to, well, these mayors, I think, are starting to become more progressive in entertaining the possibility of having online workers in their locality. But the locality itself also needs to understand and welcome doing online work. And I somehow I feel like there's a stigma that a person doing online work is just doing something on the side, and it's not something that would be something that can be done as a real job, or as a job that would increase their welfare. And that's the cultural barrier that that needs to be also overcome in order for us to address this. And I think finally is it has also been mentioned that what we're trying to do, the new wine and old wineskins, and we're trying to stretch our regulations, our social security regulations for these types of workers that are having a what do you call this? Is it are their work? Is it a permanent type of job, or is it something like no employer-employee relationship? Are they on a contractual basis? And what would happen to their social security? That again also needs to be addressed, because you may have a lot of those workers in your locality, but what would happen in times of crisis, and they would rely on social security, and they're not getting that because of the old wineskins that we're trying to implement on them.
Thank you. Wow, that actually is a very important point about like an informality of the digital jobs still exist. Well, I'm going to give all the panelists maybe a minute to give us a key takeaway. So let's start with Stephanie. If you want to give the audience here and the participants one key takeaway, what would that be?
Thanks very much, Sin Young. I think my key message would be that continuing to discuss the implications of these new approaches is absolutely critical. It needs to be done working closely with the business community, but also we need to build up the regulatory capability in developing countries, because, you know, without those basic frameworks for the policies, we're going to keep running into this fragmentation and friction around data flows.
Thomas, you have any key takeaway?
Sure. I would say that, you know, coming out of the pandemic, you know, people realized the importance of the digital economy. They all got used to, you know, doing services online and really pushing the idea that digital jobs and, you know, are pretty much unlimited in, you know, in potential. And they also potentially have a much lower, say, carbon footprint than regular jobs, especially when you don't have to commute back and forth. And, you know, that is just such a compelling story that governments need to really understand, so they can drive this regulation in a way that promotes that, you know, in an inclusive way. And I think that, you know, there's a lot of examples, and we can do a lot to, you know, to support that in our programs. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. So my key takeaway would be to continue to work on different fronts at the same time, because I think it has been mentioned in the last intervention by Francis. This many elements are actually happening at the domestic level, and domestic regulation seems to be, in fact, quite challenging, even to engage in this international regulation, digital rules, and and I think the most important is, when we look at digital agreements or RCEP or whatever negotiations we want to to enter in, is to understand the motivations and what are the constraints, let's say the constraints of countries, and to understand this digital divide really from the roots. Because we noticed in RCEP, for example, that countries, there is a correlation between the digital restrictiveness index and the services liberalization rates. So it really shows that basically what you have domestically, you tend to reflect them in your negotiating positions, simply because this is what you know, and it's difficult to change. So yes, so my takeaway would be help countries to work domestically with national agencies, involve them in international negotiations, so that to make further progress.
My key takeaway would be taking a crystal ball and trying to see what's going to happen in the future. And to tell you the truth, I cannot say I cannot say what will happen in the future, because the international architecture for digital policies and regulations are rapidly changing, mainly because of the rapidly evolving technological landscape. So there's always talks, and even the JSI is still being debated and being discussed. So, but the economies are trying to adopt and adapt their domestic economy to the evolving landscape, and I think it's very important for EDB to engage more developing countries in order to give them the avenue to fruitfully intervene in the global discussions on digital trade and e-commerce. For example, the JSI on electronic e-commerce is ongoing, and then there are also other topics that are being discussed, such as e-invoicing, telecommunications, cryptography, and even the stock taking of policies. So all of these are happening at the international level, and there's developing economies with limited capacity should be engaged and capacitated in order for them to have a voice on that table.
Thank you. Well, we live in the era of big change and uncertainty. And I really appreciate all the panelists sharing great ideas. Every change comes with both opportunities and challenges. I don't want to summarize. I don't think there's any possibility to summarize this big, great idea. But for all these great ideas, I think the driving forces are still the communication and then the open dialogue like this. And then we hope that this continues. Thank you very much. I do hope everybody gives a round of applause to excellent panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Sin Young for the moderation and to our panelists, especially those who are connected virtually. And thank you for this very insightful discussion. And finally, we have the closing remarks. We are moving towards the end of the event today. So I would like to invite my colleague, Matthias Helbel, who is joining us also virtually. Matthias is also one of the editors of this edited volume, and he contributed to the preparation and drafting of this report, and we're very glad to have you. Matthias is senior economist on the Regional Cooperation and Integration Division, and he's currently on leave with the Science Division at the World Health Organization. Over to you, Matthias.
Thank you so much, Rolando. After all these very enriching discussions and presentations that we had, I won't be very long. Let me first say a big thanks to all the speakers of the book launch today. We very much appreciate their invaluable contributions. A big thanks also to the audience for joining us today. We very much hope that the book launch and the book itself will help you to better understand the main drivers and policies related to digital services trade. Let me also take the opportunity on behalf of the editors of this book to express our deep gratitude to all those who made the publication of this book possible. First of all, a big thank you goes to all the authors who delivered exceptional content and with whom we very much enjoyed collaborating. Second, we very much are grateful to our director, Ms. Sin Young Park, for always being there for us when we edited this book and wrote the book, and for her excellent overall supervision. We also owe our gratitude to all those who worked tirelessly to produce this book and also to make this book launch possible, namely James Unwin, Joseph Maclimo, Erickson Mercado, Tuesday Soriano, Carol Ongchanko, and Pia Asuncion Tenchaves. As you have heard over the last 90 minutes, our book covers a lot of ground, and hopefully it makes a useful contribution to the existing literature and policy debate on this topic. And it's not without some pride that I can say that other international organizations such as UNESCAP in Bangkok, they have now started to undertake research on exactly the same topic. So there's a lot of interest in advancing our knowledge on this topic and to ultimately also come up with appropriate policies. But let's also be modest. While our book provides a thorough analysis of various aspects of digital services trade, we have not been able to cover all questions that we initially wanted. And there were also other questions that came up while we were doing this research, as it's quite typical once you explore uncharted waters. For example, one question that triggered our interest from the beginning was whether digital services trade delivers for all. We all know that trade opening can be a very powerful tool to generate economic growth. At the same time, we need to ensure that the benefits of trade opening are shared across the economy and the society. Otherwise, we might be confronted with a backlash against freer trade. So when we conceived the book, we knew that economic models existed to analyze how trade opening affects different sectors and income groups. However, we realized then that we did not have enough granular data to conduct a thorough empirical analysis. Now, as digitalization is transforming our entire economic and social system, there is hope that we will soon have more comprehensive data at hand. And this will, of course, then enable us to better understand the opportunities and challenges emerging from more digital services trade. And this would eventually help to fine-tune trade and all the related policies. We also need additional work at the country level, I think. As our book shows, the economies within Asia and the Pacific are at different stages of development in trade of digital services. And while the prospects for those economies to take part in digital services trade are promising, a lot of work remains to be done to seize opportunities and join the global marketplace of digital services trade. Governments now need to develop specific policies to develop their respective competitive advantages in digital services. And as we have heard today, there are several key dimensions of policy action. And let me just name 5. One is this human capital development. Second, digital connectivity. Third, information and communication technology investment. Fourth, an enabling policy and regulatory environment. And fifth, I would say it's regional and international cooperation. Let me conclude by saying that ADB stands ready to support its members to spur digital services trade and to make it an engine for sustainable and equitable growth for the entire region. That's all from me. Thank you so much again for joining us today. And we hope to see you soon at the next event that we are having. And I wish you a nice rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthias. And with this, let me thank all the participants today and our people who connected virtually. Thank you for being with us today. And the link to the publication is available, so please feel free to share with your connections. Thank you again, and we hope to see you soon for the next presentation here at ADB. Thank you.